Welcome to all of my members to this extended step-by-step watercolour atmospheric sunset cityscape. It's quite difficult to say that. Using a limited palette just to keep things nice and simple for you. And just to say a big thank you to Lilia from the Patreon membership for the suggestion of painting a cityscape with a lovely sunset. I'm using Saunders Waterford watercolour paper, 300 grams, and it has a cold pressed surface, so it's got a little bit of texture. A full list of the materials I'm using and the photo link can be found in the description below. And for those of you on the Patreon membership, you can find a downloadable sketch outline for this painting. I'm mixing up a very thin wash of Quinacridone Gold, and I'm using my size 6 brush with plenty of water. This is going to be for the sky and also for a thin wash over the pavement and background buildings. I'm now mixing up some red. It's Winsor red, but you could use cadmium red, and for the Quinacridone Gold you could use raw sienna. I'm going to tilt my board here, so I'm just using a tube of watercolour there just to tilt it at quite a slight angle, and I'm wetting the sky area now with my size 14 brush. Just use a nice large brush, and I'm just painting around the sun. Now I've actually drawn around the cap of one of my watercolour tubes as a stencil really for the sun. So use something that to pick out something circular that suits the size that you want. And I'm just really carefully wetting around the edge. I'm not that careful a person actually, so it's not going to be perfect, but I can sort that out later and I'll show you how, so don't worry too much. So I'm now painting the Quinacridone Gold around the horizon area and along the pavement, along the bridge, just really sort of bringing it down to the bottom of the painting there. And just to say, I'm using framing tape, the tape around the edge there. It's like masking tape. It's not the gummed tape that you use to stretch paper, which is incredibly difficult to get off. With framing tape, if your watercolour paper likes it, it should come off okay. And if you have any problems with that, try to use a hairdryer to warm up the glue to remove the framing tape or masking tape. And as you saw there, I put a red-orange sort of 3/4 of the way up the sky there. And that's to prevent the blue that I'm going to use later turning green. I'll explain more later. So I've added a little bit of red here, and I'm painting this wet on wet onto the wet surface. I'm using my size 10 brush, and because it's running where I don't want it to run, just tilt your painting and let it all run in the direction you want it to go. And I'm using my damp brush as well just to get things moving. I've just got some really creamy cadmium yellow pale there, painting around the sun with my size 6 brush, and I've just mixed up an orange now, the yellow and red, creamier colour, because I'm painting some clouds around the sun there. This sunset sky, it's creamier paint, so you can see the background is damp now, those very pale colours, so I'm painting richer colours on top, and it's quite a nice way of painting a sunset sky. So while that's sort of resting, I mix up a very, very dilute wash of ultramarine with a tiny pinch of red, just so it's not bright blue, and I've just made that slightly stronger. It was a bit too pale, and I'm painting this damp into damp with my size 10 brush, and I brought it down to a red wash that I put there. It's like a barrier between the yellow and the blue, so you don't get a green sky. It's a good little tip there. So whenever you're painting a blue sky that's right above at the top of the painting, always make sure that you've got some sort of pink or red or orangey barrier between that and any yellow paint, raw sienna paint or Quinacridone Gold, because your blue will usually turn green, and that may not be what you want, especially in a sunset sky. I'm using an even richer orangey colour here with my size 6 brush and doing lots of tilting. Because the paper is damp, sometimes it doesn't move as much, so I'm just sort of using my brush, which is the same consistency of wetness, if that makes any sense, to the paper, so you don't add any more water to the paper, so there's no danger of back runs. And I'm just getting the paint to move a little bit as I'm tilting it. So I'm going to leave the sky there now. I'm just mixing up a little bit of ultramarine and really just using some of the orange that I have there as well. And it's a very pale wash, and I'm just painting this damp into wet or damp into damp onto the pavement and onto the bridge there. It's just a very neutral grey colour, and it's kind of like at this stage of a watercolour painting, we're painting all the light and sort of not quite mid-tones yet, because these will dry quite pale as well. I'm using my size 10 brush. I'm still giving little hints of grey blues, damp into damp, onto the sort of foreground area of this painting. I've mixed up a tiny touch of pink into my ultramarine with a pinch of, as you can see there, the Quinacridone gold. It just neutralizes a little bit, and I'm painting this. These are representing the buildings, the sort of out of focus buildings in the misty sort of background, and I'm painting this damp into damp with my size 6 brush. But if you find the brush is putting out too much paint, go to a smaller brush so it doesn't give off as much paint there, and take off some of the excess paint on a piece of paper towel as well. It just controls the dampness of your brush. I'm painting all of the buildings damp into damp, even the ones in the sort of in front of those misty ones, so everything gets an equal share of this colour. But I'm now concentrating on these really fuzzy ones now in the distance. Just keep it really simple. I'm just almost doing a pointy triangle here, so I'm just sort of basic sort of building shapes, keeping it simple. But remember, your brush needs to be damp, not too wet, so it bleeds into the sky. If you are at all worried at this stage, wait for your painting to dry, and you could paint this wet on dry, just a very pale wash. It may not have the soft edge, but you may avoid back runs, so don't worry. There's always ways round solutions in watercolour painting. And I'm just building up another sort of greyish wash now on the bridge there as well, and in the foreground, just to build up some more tonal values, and I'm going to let that dry. My painting has dried naturally, and what I'm doing now is I'm actually rubbing out the pencil line that I drew for the stencil for the sun, just to get rid of that. I'm using a plastic rubber, so I've got a little bit of residue there, so I've just brushed that away a little. And it has got rid of the pencil line, but I've got a bit of a wobbly circle, even though I drew a circle. I told you I wasn't that careful. So I'm using my stencil brush. You may not need to do it, but it creates a nice soft fuzzy edge. So I'm just lifting off this yellow, which comes off quite nicely, and just going in a circular way. Sorry you can't see this. And then I'm going to use some paper towel just to take off the excess there, just blot that off, so you've got a nice a glow around the sun there. I'm mixing up some ultramarine with some red. I find using the red a little bit better than the pink. The pink and ultramarine make a beautiful violet. If you add red to ultramarine, it's more of a grey violet blue, and you can get different sort of, if you add more blue, it's more of a blue violet grey, and more red, it becomes sort of a red violet grey, if that makes any sense. But it's a very useful colour mix. And if it's too violet still with the red, add a tiny touch of yellow. So I'm painting now this blue violet grey colour, bit of a mouthful, but it's the background buildings just above the bridge there, but you can still see those very fuzzy buildings in the distance. I'm trying to create a little bit of variety on the rooftops and varying the wash as well. So I'm adding a little bit of water to the very distant buildings, and the ones to the left are a bit nearer to the viewer. And I'm just adding lots of water as I go to the right there to really sort of make it fade away, because I'm going to be putting trees there and I don't want it to be too busy or too dark tonally. And I'm just putting that grey wash then on the right hand side. I'm still using my size 6 brush here, and I'm painting wet on dry some markings just at the bottom of the bridge there, and even some of the markings on the pavement here, some of the paving stones. I'm keeping it very loose. If you want to get a little bit more detail, please do so, because it's quite nice, because everyone's got different styles. And I'm painting here, I've slowed the film down a little bit just to paint the sort of the curvature of the road, and I'm keeping the tonal values stronger in the foreground, and I'm going to pale them down a little bit as they go in the distance to create depth as well. I'm turning my painting sideways. You may not need to do this. I just find it easier painting things that are quite tall, like trees and things. I just find I can access it easier. And I'm mixing up now some brown and blue, but you could use the Quinacridone gold and the blue as well. But I'm trying to make it quite a neutral, sludgy green colour. So you could use ultramarine, a touch of yellow and a touch of brown, but sometimes just mixing up colours in your palette, you can get a sludgy colour as well. And I always say to students, don't wash your palettes, because you might want to use those sort of mixes that are on there for your future paintings. But I'm using side brush, dry brush. So it's the belly of the brush, not the tip. The tip of the brush, the paint comes out quicker. And the belly of the brush, the paint sort of comes out slower, and you can catch the tooth of the paper there as well to create texture. So this wouldn't work so well on hot press smooth paper. It's difficult to get that texture. But as I'm sort of scrubbing a little bit with the side of the brush there to create some texture with the foliage, I don't want to create too much detail. It's just to give a little bit of information here. And I'm keeping the tonal value quite pale. My painting has dried now, and I'm painting the tree trunks. I'm using my size 4 brush, and I've mixed up ultramarine and burnt sienna. And I'm just working my way. Now I'm painting the sort of darkest trees first, wet on dry, and just painting in sort of smaller branches. I'm not going to give these trees too much attention. They're just going to be there on the right hand side, a little bit of an anchor. And I'm just softening the bottom of the trees now to make them look like they're growing out of the ground and more natural. And I've just sort of rinsed my brush there, and I'm just sort of pulling that paint at the bottom there to create the look of a cast shadow. And I'm continuing on now, painting the trees as they go further away, just making them slightly smaller and less detail in a way as you go into the distance there. Again, if you find it easy even to turn your painting upside down and paint the trees in, go for it. But I'm actually going slightly smaller and painting thinner trees to create the illusion that they're sort of a little way behind those foreground trees there, and just to create a little cluster in a way, and painting more branches wet on dry and making them slightly paler again, so they look like they're sort of in the distance slightly. I'm just giving a little spatter now with this ultramarine and burnt sienna wet on dry. I've added a little bit of the orangey colour there as well, a little bit of warmth just at the top of the foliage there to create a little bit of texture. And I just like that little added bit of information really and detail. It just kind of finishes that area off nicely. I'm going back now with ultramarine pink and some burnt sienna. The pink I'm using is Quinacridone Magenta. And I'm just going to paint now the bridge wet on dry. So it's quite a strong, I've just added a touch more burnt sienna. It looked a bit too violet. that first stroke. Sometimes I do that. I'll mix a colour, I'll paint it on, and I think, oh, that's not quite how I imagined it would look, and I made an adjustment. Now, you may not feel as confident to do that. So what I would suggest is to get a rough piece of watercolour paper and paint your little wash, and then just put it alongside your painting just to see if it looks right. And then if it doesn't, you can make the changes. What I'm doing is here, I'm just diluted a little bit here, just to make it look paler as it's going away. And you can see I use my fingertips sometimes just to push the paint around a bit. So it's like almost like a dry brush kind of effect. So I'm not introducing any more liquid, and I'm just pushing the paint. So I'm just softening the left hand side of the bridge and putting a little bit more detail on the right hand side. This is quite abstract. I'm just creating, it's just marks really. I decided not to put the benches in. I just thought it'd just get a bit too fiddly, and you know, I just wanted to, the sun was the focal point, and I just wanted to draw your eye there. I wanted some people walking. I've got lampposts, I've got buildings, trees, and so I decided to keep it simple. But by all means, pop them in. And I'm actually now just painting a few more marks in the road here. It's slightly darker, obviously, in the foreground to create depth, and the marks smaller as well in the distance as they go away. And it's just to lead your eye through. Diagonals are a great asset when you're painting on, obviously, on a 2D surface to create a 3D illusion. And I just softened something there just because it was coming forward a bit much. So do feel free to kind of soften something with a damp brush and take it off with some paper towel. I'm just painting some details now, wet on dry. I've dried off my painting onto the bridge. And as these marks go away, they get smaller and paler. And I'm keeping this very loose. If you want to create a little bit more detail, do so. It's just kind of my style in a way. And I wanted to show you that as well, just to show you my loose sort of style as I paint cityscapes and details like this. And I'm just painting a little bit more darks now, these little paving stones on the left hand side, wet on dry, using mainly ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm painting in the street lamps now. I'm using my size 4 brush, again with the ultramarine and burnt sienna. And this street lamp here really is the star of the street lamps, and it's bigger, and I'm going to just put a little bit more detail and make it darker in tonal value as well. So I've actually got a creamy mix there, and you could use something like Paynes grey and the Quinacridone Magenta, and if you don't have Paynes grey, you could use Indigo and any pink. All red will do. And I'm using this lovely Paynes grey and red here just to paint wet on dry some markings and details on the bridge wall, just on the left hand side in the foreground and on the lamp, just to really sort of bring these sort of foreground objects and structures forward to create depth in the painting. I thought I'd mix up a little bit more ultramarine and just put a few more markings on the right hand side and on this tree here, which is kind of the nearest, largest tree to the foreground. I thought I'd just build that up a little bit darker, again, just to create some depth, the illusion of depth that is, by using tonal value. And I'm painting a few more branches in as well, just to add some more details. Now I'm painting people in the distance, and I use kind of like an arch window for their bodies and just sort of 2 sticks for their legs, because they are little people, and give them really small heads, and just sort of maybe sort of stick out some elbows as well from the arch window and a little cast shadow, and you're good to go. I will put a link in the description below of how to paint people, or a little bit more detail in that, and I hope you find that helpful. I'm adding a touch more details now to the lamp, and I'm painting, or I've invented some people here using my imagination, some people on the left hand side, and I'm painting this wet on dry using my size 4 brush. And again, you can see I've used the arch window, 2 lines for the legs, sort of thicker lines, one shorter than the other, so they look like they're walking, and a little bit of cast shadow. It grounds them, and it just, you know, it creates the illusion. You saw that I just pushed that paint back with my fingertips there just to soften the outside edge of that shadow, that cast shadow. I'm using the tip of my size 4 brush just to paint some little cobbled stones here, using the mix of ultramarine and burnt sienna, or you could use the Paynes grey and pink. I'm using Winsor red here, really creamy, wet on dry with my size 4 brush. It's a little bit of a constable trick there, using red to really draw your eye in. It adds a pop of colour. I'm spattering the foreground just to create a little bit more texture. And because of those splatters, those splatter birds have gone loose there, I'm actually creating some birds in the distance there, using the little splatters as their kind of bodies. I'm just building up a little touch of dark. Again, you can use the Paynes grey and pink or ultramarine and brown, just to really, I mean, they really do create depth and movement in a painting, sort of life in a way. And it draws your eye into the distance. What I'm doing now is I'm using the stencil brush. You could use a cotton bud, and just to soften some of those sort of distant colours, but it creates a bit of atmosphere. It's sort of mistiness, so you're taking away some of those hard edges. Most of the colours that I've used do lift off really easily, but remember, less is more. Don't get too carried away. I'm using a little bit of white gouache now. The painting has dried. I'm using my size 4 brush, and I'm just putting a few little highlights and whites in here and there where you may have lost them when you were painting your picture. Remember, less is more, so don't get too carried away with this. I'm mainly painting it in the foreground, a little bit on the people and on the lamps. And I've taken off my framing tape now to reveal a lovely white border, and it sets the painting off really nicely, and to see if I need to do any more, but I think I will leave it there. Thank you so much for watching this extended tutorial. I really hope you've enjoyed it and it inspires you to have a go at a cityscape like this with a limited palette. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. And if you'd like to share your work, remember you can share them on the members Facebook page. Details about that are in the description below. Thank you again for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.